The summer sun poured through the tall windows of the sprawling mansion, making the polished marble floors shine like mirrors. Maria moved quietly through the living room, her cleaning cloth in one hand, a silver tray balanced in the other. She had worked for the Davenport family for almost 5 years now, and she had learned to blend into background. Her son, Elijah, sat at the far end of the room, reading a worn-out paperback book he'd borrowed from the library. At just 12 years old, Elijah was tall for his age, with curious eyes that always seemed to be studying everything around him. Maria usually didn't bring him to work, but it was the first day of summer vacation, and she couldn't leave him alone at home. On the far side of the room, Richard Davenport, a man whose wealth could buy entire neighborhoods, lounged in his leather chair. His sharp blue eyes followed Elijah for a moment before drifting to the ornate chessboard set up on a table nearby. "You play chess, boy?" Richard's deep voice filled the space. Maria stiffened instantly. "Sir, Elijah's just—" "It's fine, Mom," Elijah said softly, closing his book. "A little." Richard smirked, the kind of smirk that carried both amusement and condescension. "A little, huh? Well, I'm bored. Let's see what you've got." Maria opened her mouth to protest, but Richard was already motioning Elijah over. The polished pieces gleamed under the sunlight as Richard casually set them into position. "Don't worry," he said with a chuckle. "I'll go easy on you." Elijah sat across from him, his fingers brushing lightly over the pawns. His eyes studied the board with quiet intensity. And in that moment, Maria noticed something in her son's expression she hadn't seen before. Focus, sharp and unwavering. The first move was Richard's. He played quickly, confidently, barely glancing up as if the game was already his. But Elijah responded instantly, his small hands moving a knight into a position that made Richard raise an eyebrow. Maria stood behind them, wringing her cleaning cloth, trying to read her son's face. She didn't know much about chess, but she could feel the shift in the room, the quiet tension that came when two minds started to measure each other. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading ever so slightly. "Interesting move," he murmured. "Let's see if you can keep up." Elijah didn't answer. He just watched the board, as if every possible outcome was already playing out in his head. Maria's heart pounded. She didn't know it yet, but this harmless little game was about to change everything. Richard's fingers tapped the table lightly as he studied the board. The boy's opening had been unusual, nothing like the timid moves he expected from a beginner. Still, he told himself it was just luck. He slid his queen out early, aiming to pressure Elijah. "Most people play it safe in the beginning," Richard said, his voice half teasing, half patronizing. "But that's fine. We'll keep it interesting." Elijah's eyes flickered briefly toward him, then back to the pieces. His reply was swift, a bishop sliding across the board, pinning one of Richard's knights. Maria didn't know the rules of chess well enough to understand what was happening, but she could see her employer's face changing. The playful smirk was gone, replaced by a furrow in his brow. "You've played before," Richard said flatly. "A little," Elijah repeated. "How much is a little?" Richard asked, leaning forward. Elijah shrugged. "Just a few hours here and there online." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Hours? Not years." "No, sir." The room went silent for a moment, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Richard made his next move slower this time, studying the board more carefully. Elijah didn't hesitate for even a second before countering. Move after move, the balance of the game began to tilt. Elijah's small, deliberate hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to brag. Each piece he touched seemed to land in a place that disrupted Richard's plans. Maria's chest tightened as she watched. She knew her son was bright. He'd always been quick to learn things. But this was different. This was calculated, almost like he could see the game 10 steps ahead. Richard, now sitting upright and gripping the armrest of his chair, finally leaned forward, both elbows on the table. "You think you can beat me, boy?" Elijah's voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "I'm just playing the best I can." Richard chuckled, but it wasn't lighthearted anymore. It was sharp, edged with frustration. He tried an aggressive attack, pushing his rook deep into Elijah's side of the board. But Elijah responded with a quiet check. forcing Richard's king to move. For the first time, Richard didn't make a move right away. He stared at the board, then at Elijah. The boy's gaze never wavered. Maria felt the air in the room thicken. She could sense something shifting, not just in the game, but in the way Richard looked at her son. When Richard finally made his move, Elijah countered instantly. And this time, Richard didn't hide his surprise. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Richard asked. Elijah's answer was simple. "I just see it." Maria's pulse quickened. She had no idea that those 3 quiet words would soon echo far beyond this room. Richard sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He studied Elijah with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something Maria couldn't quite name. "You just see it?" Richard repeated, his voice low. Elijah nodded, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. His eyes remained on the chessboard, as if the game itself demanded his complete attention. Richard moved a pawn forward, trying to open a line for his rook. Elijah's response was immediate, sliding his knight into a position that forced Richard to rethink his next move entirely. Maria watched Richard's jaw tighten. She'd seen him negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without a single bead of sweat, but now, over a board game with a 12-year-old, his composure seemed to be slipping. "You're not just playing moves," Richard said after a moment. "You're setting traps." Elijah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Isn't that what chess is?" The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. The distant hum of the mansion's air conditioning was the only sound apart from the click of the chess pieces. Richard tried to bait Elijah into a risky exchange, sacrificing a rook for what he assumed would be a guaranteed checkmate later. But Elijah didn't take it. Instead, he maneuvered his pieces into a slow, tightening net around Richard's king. Maria, standing with her cleaning cloth clutched tightly in her hands, couldn't follow every move, but she could see the pattern. The way Richard's available squares were shrinking one by one. "You ever played in a tournament?" Richard asked, breaking the silence. "No, sir." "Why not?" Elijah shrugged. "No one ever asked me to." That answer seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any move on the board. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward Maria, but she looked away. The game pressed on, each turn quicker than the last. Elijah's confidence never wavered, while Richard began glancing at the board from different angles, muttering under his breath. And then it happened. "Check," Elijah said quietly. His voice was soft, but the word hit the room like a hammer. Richard's eyes darted across the board, searching for a way out. His fingers hovered over his king, then over his rook, before finally moving a pawn in desperation. Elijah moved again, swift, decisive. "Checkmate." The word hung in the air, echoing off the marble floors. Richard stared at the board, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He was a man used to winning, used to control, and now a boy had dismantled him piece by piece. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know if she should be proud, scared, or both. Richard finally leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You're not just good, Elijah," he said, his voice almost grudging. "You're dangerous." Elijah looked up for the first time since the game began. "It's just a game, sir." But Maria could tell Richard didn't believe that. Not for a second. For a long moment, Richard didn't speak. He just sat there, his gaze flicking between Elijah and the chessboard, as if trying to reconcile what had just happened. Finally, he pushed his chair back and stood. "Come with me," he said. Maria stepped forward protectively. "Sir, where?" Richard held up a hand. "Relax, Maria. I just want to show him something." Elijah glanced at his mother, and she hesitated before giving him a small nod. Slowly, he followed Richard down the hallway, the polished floors reflecting their steps. They stopped in front of a door Maria had never been allowed through in all her years working here. Richard unlocked it and swung it open, revealing a room unlike anything Elijah had ever seen. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes and sleek, modern chess manuals. In the center was a large oak table with a chessboard carved directly into it, surrounded by high-backed chairs. On the far side stood a glass display case holding dozens of trophies, golden kings, silver rooks, gleaming plaques engraved with Richard's name. "This," Richard said, gesturing around the room, "is where I play when I'm serious." Elijah's eyes darted from the trophies to the books. "You've won all these?" Richard smirked. "Most of them. Some are from matches I sponsored. But make no mistake, I've beaten some of the best in the country in this very room." He turned, eyeing Elijah carefully. "And now I've been beaten by you." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "It was just one game." Richard stepped closer. "One game is enough to tell me when someone's exceptional." He glanced toward a trophy at the top of the case. "You know, I was a chess prodigy once. Won my first state title at 14. Everyone thought I'd go pro, but I took a different path. Business." Elijah studied the board on the table. "Do you still play in tournaments?" "Not in years," Richard said. "Too busy making money." He paused and added, "But you could, and you could win." Elijah looked surprised. "Why?" "Because," Richard said slowly, "you see the game like a grandmaster does. That's rare, Elijah. Very rare." Maria had followed them quietly, standing at the doorway now. She didn't like the way Richard's eyes gleamed, not with malice, but with an intensity that felt consuming. Richard turned to her. "Maria, do you realize what your son could be?" She crossed her arms. "I know he's smart." Richard shook his head. "Smart is one thing. This is genius." Elijah lowered his gaze, unsure what to say. But in that quiet room, filled with the scent of polished wood and old books, something began to take root, a possibility neither he nor his mother had ever considered before. Maria's stomach tightened as Richard's words hung in the air. She'd spent her life teaching Elijah to be humble, to keep his head down. Genius was a dangerous thing in the wrong hands, and she wasn't sure if Richard Davenport's were the right ones. "Sir," she began cautiously, "Elijah's just a boy. He doesn't need—" "What he needs," Richard interrupted, "is opportunity. Do you have any idea what kind of doors could open for him?" Maria glanced at her son. Elijah was staring at the chessboard on the oak table, his mind already drifting into its quiet, strategic world. Richard walked over to bookshelves and pulled down a thick, black-bound volume. He placed it in front of Elijah, The Art of Attack in Chess. "This book," Richard said, tapping the cover, "taught me more about winning than any coach ever could. If you read it and study it, I can make some calls. I know people, grandmasters, coaches, sponsors. You could be competing in real tournaments within months." Elijah's eyes widened slightly. "Real tournaments?" Maria stepped forward. "And what would that cost?" Richard looked at her, a hint of offense in his eyes. "Nothing. I'd sponsor him. Pay for everything, travel, coaching, entry fees. Consider it an investment." The word investment made Maria uneasy. People like Richard never gave something for nothing. But Elijah's gaze was locked on the trophies behind the glass, and she could see the spark there, a hunger for a challenge. "Mom," Elijah said quietly, "just one tournament. Please." Maria hesitated. She'd worked for rich families long enough to know how quickly promises could turn into chains. But she also knew her son's mind needed more than the small world she could give him. Richard sensed her hesitation and softened his tone. "Maria, this is a gift. I'm not trying to take him from you. I just want to see how far he can go. If he doesn't like it, he walks away." Elijah turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm actually good at this?" Maria felt her chest tighten. She wanted to protect him from disappointment, from pressure, from the ruthless expectations of people like Richard. But she also couldn't ignore the possibility that this strange, unexpected moment could be the beginning of something extraordinary. Finally, she exhaled. "One tournament. That's it." Richard smiled. "That's all I'm asking." But as he shook Elijah's hand, Maria caught the look in his eyes, a glint that told her he was already thinking 10 moves ahead. The weeks that followed moved faster than Maria could believe. Every afternoon after her shifts, she and Elijah returned to mansion. Richard had transformed the oak table chess room into Elijah's training ground. Books were stacked high. A laptop displayed endless streams of chess puzzles, and a retired grandmaster named Victor began stopping by twice a week to coach him. Victor was a quiet sharp-eyed man with a heavy Russian accent. The first day, he studied Elijah's moves in silence, then finally said, "You do not play like a child. You play like someone who has lived this game for decades." Under Victor's guidance, Elijah's skills sharpened. His eyes read the board differently now, more precise, more dangerous. Maria would sit quietly in the corner during lessons, torn between pride and unease. Richard often stood nearby, arms folded, watching like a man overseeing the growth of a valuable asset. The tournament came sooner than she expected. A state-level junior championship in a grand hotel ballroom. The place buzzed with nervous energy, dozens of kids in pressed shirts and their parents whispering last-minute advice. Elijah, in his best clothes, sat at his first board across from a boy 2 years older, already a regional champion. The match drew a small crowd. Maria stood in the back, wringing her hands, watching her son's calm, steady gaze. From the first move, Elijah played like the board was his territory. Pieces fell, one after another, until his opponent leaned back, pale, and extended a reluctant hand. It didn't stop there. Round after round, Elijah dismantled opponents. Older kids, higher seeds, even the tournament favorite. Each win drew more attention. Coaches whispered, cameras appeared, and by the final match, the crowd was 3 rows deep. Maria's heart pounded as she watched her son's final opponent falter. The end came with Elijah's quiet, devastating word. Checkmate. The ballroom erupted in applause. Richard clapped slowly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Victor simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. After the trophy ceremony, reporters swarmed. One asked Elijah how it felt to win his first tournament. He looked past the microphones, past the cameras, and found his mother in the crowd. "It feels," he said softly, "like the first move of a very long game." Maria smiled, but deep inside, she felt that same unease from Richard's living room weeks ago. She knew genius had a cost. And as Elijah stood there holding his trophy, with Richard's hand resting firmly on his shoulder, she wondered, not for the first time, who would be paying it. The applause swelled again, but in Maria's mind, the sound was like the ticking of a chess clock. Somewhere, she could feel the game already moving toward its next move and its consequences.